Quero começar, então, em nome da Fundação Lauro Campos, dando boas-vindas a todos vocês. E começar agradecendo a nossa editora Boitempo, aqui na mesa representada pelo Matias Seibel, que é a editora que patrocina, né, que edita os livros do nosso ilustre convidado, David Harvey. Agradecer a ele pela disposição de estar aqui, de fazer todas essas viagens que ele tem feito, com esse trabalho espetacular a respeito do capital, do Marx, do marxismo. Agradecer ao presidente da Fundação Lauro Campos, Roberto Robaina, que me nomeou para estar aqui no lugar dele hoje. E o Roberto tem sido um grande incentivador da leitura das obras do Marx, do marxismo, no meio da esquerda socialista, aqui no Rio Grande do Sul e no Brasil. E, por isso, como presidente da Fundação Lauro Campos, ele fez questão de ser parte desses dois grandes eventos que Porto Alegre foi palco, e não só Porto Alegre, mas também São Paulo, Salvador e Rio de Janeiro e Brasília, onde tivemos a presença do Slavoj Žižek, que é também um intelectual extremamente importante no contexto da luta anticapitalista. E hoje aqui com o David Harvey, que traz para nós esse espetacular trabalho a respeito do capital. E vocês aqui, pelo que eu estou percebendo no público, são, em grande parte, estudantes e, por isso, devem sentir, dentro das universidades, como o marxismo não tem o espaço que merece e que deveria ter dentro das nossas universidades. E isso não é por acaso. Eu quero chamar aqui a nossa vereadora, Sofia Cavedon, que também representa a Câmara de Vereadores de Porto Alegre, que também, junto com a Fundação Lauro Campos e com a Boitempo, é uma das patrocinadoras desse nosso evento. Mas eu dizia que o marxismo não tem o espaço que merece, que deveria ter dentro da academia, porque ele vai se chocar, as bases, os pressupostos do marxismo vão se chocar com os interesses da classe dominante, com a ideologia dominante também dentro das universidades. A ideia de que a realidade não pode ser mudada, a ideia de que o homem não pode se transformar, a ideia de que o capitalismo é o último estágio do desenvolvimento da humanidade, que, portanto, não há possibilidades de superação. A ideia de que o Estado é neutro e de que, portanto, ele serve aos interesses comuns. E o marxismo vai justamente mostrar o oposto. E as elaborações do Marx vão justamente mostrar o oposto, que a realidade é dada historicamente, condicionada historicamente, que o homem é um eterno autoconstruir e que, portanto, ele pode sim se transformar e deixar de ter uma essência egoísta, uma essência mesquinha, que pode se transformar num ser mais generoso e que o capitalismo é um modo de produção também que está condicionado pela história, apenas mais um ao longo de toda a história da humanidade, de outros tantos, e que, portanto, ele pode sim ser superado. E que o Estado, ao contrário de ser neutro, é um instrumento da classe social que detém o poder econômico, e que, portanto, no limite, inclusive, usa da violência para defender os interesses dessa classe economicamente dominante. E esse tema da violência do Estado hoje está muito presente para nós, e eu gostaria de lembrar o que aconteceu na sexta-feira passada, no Rio de Janeiro, quando, mais uma vez, como já acontece ao longo dos 500 anos da história do Brasil, os índios brasileiros foram, mais uma vez, despejados, dessa vez no Museu do Índio, e onde, através da violência policial, dezenas de pessoas, né, apanharam da polícia, várias foram presas, e hoje, no Rio de Janeiro, nesse mesmo horário que nós estamos aqui reunidos, está acontecendo um grande ato de protesto contra essa violência policial, contra essa violência estatal, tá, em nome dos interesses dos grandes empreendimentos da Copa do Mundo. E aí a gente vê, de fato, esse papel do Estado exercendo, através da violência, defendendo e garantindo os interesses da classe dominante. E, ao mesmo tempo, também protestando contra a figura que preside a Comissão de Direitos Humanos da Câmara dos Deputados, né, que se transformou já em uma luta de todos aqueles que defendem os direitos humanos e que querem, de fato, uma comissão na Câmara minimamente capaz de enxergar os direitos humanos como direitos históricos que são de todos e que precisam ser defendidos de uma forma coerente. Então, eu vou deixar vocês com, em primeiro, a Sofia Cavedon, que vai fazer a sua saudação em nome da Câmara de Vereadores, o Matias, que vai também apresentar o nosso convidado, que vocês certamente já conhecem, mas ele vai relatar aqui as últimas atividades que o David Harvey tem feito na sua vida acadêmica. E depois o David Harvey vai fazer a sua intervenção, que deve durar 1 hora e pouco, e depois nós vamos abrir para questionamentos por escrito, né? Então, o pessoal que quiser, ao longo da palestra, também já pode vir deixando aqui as suas perguntas, os seus questionamentos, que depois, no final, ele vai tentar responder. Não sabemos se vai ter condições de responder a todos, mas o que der para contribuir no debate. Então, Sofia, por favor.
Boa noite a todos e a todas. Nós, direto da Câmara de Vereadores, onde a gente tem todo dia, caríssimo David, um embate e que tem, na dimensão da cidade, expressão do que é a disputa contemporânea da terra, dos centros urbanos. Por isso esse atraso. Mas eu quero, em nome da Câmara, do presidente da Câmara, da Caixa Federal, a quem nós devemos referenciar aqui, que está viabilizando que a gente possa estar assistindo uma figura, não só uma, como o Zizek foi na outra semana, expoente do pensamento contemporâneo marxista. A Caixa está nos apoiando e, de forma gratuita, poder acessar a sua fala, a sua presença, é preciso que se reconheça. Quero cumprimentar a Luciana e todas as instituições que estão compondo esse esforço, e ao nosso palestrante, ao Matias, e a Boitempo, em especial ao Boitempo, por continuar produzindo, editando, divulgando esses pensamentos que nos ajudam a entender as novas formas que o capitalismo inventa, por mais sofisticada que seja, para concentrar renda e para reproduzir desigualdade. Dizer que nós, todos que estamos aqui, e muito mais gostariam de estar, somos do Partido dos Indignados, com certeza. Indignados e que têm a consciência que a compreensão teórica é fundamental para uma praxis revolucionária, transformadora, e que a praxis precisa todo o tempo desta reflexão preciosa que a Boitempo nos alcança, que continua publicando e que nós vamos vivenciar aqui hoje. Em Porto Alegre, só para não me estender, os grandes conflitos hoje que geram, por exemplo, os comitês populares da Copa, a mobilização pública pela alegria, movimento em defesa da alegria pública, melhor dizendo, agora a crise que alguns querem reduzir a uma árvore na frente da usina, de algumas árvores na frente da usina, na verdade são evidências de um fenômeno mundial, de um dos fenômenos mundiais de acumulação de riqueza, do embate pelo direito da vida com sustentabilidade, dá direito de estar nas cidades, estar com dignidade. Então, nós não estamos longe dos grandes conflitos, nós estamos no meio dos grandes conflitos produzidos pela nova forma do capitalismo. E que bom que nós temos aqui um geógrafo que nos mostra isso, que o território não é um lugar neutro, que o território é, na verdade, uma das grandes expressões dessa exploração capitalista que oprime e segrega os seres humanos. Então, um excelente debate para nós. Obrigada por estar entre nós, querido David. Obrigada, Boitempo, por essa grande oportunidade para Porto Alegre.
Muito boa noite a todas e todos. Em primeiro lugar, saudar o nosso conferencista da noite, o professor David Harvey, saudar Luciana Genro, saudar Sofia Cavedon, representando a Câmara de Porto Alegre, e saudar a Fundação Lauro Campos, que junto com a Boitempo Editorial está promovendo esse seminário internacional. A Fundação Lauro Campos, que nós da Boitempo e eu aqui representando o conselho da revista Margem Esquerda, da Boitempo Editorial, ensaios marxistas, devemos reconhecer, publicamente o importante trabalho que a Lauro Campos vem fazendo no país pela difusão e o debate do pensamento crítico, do pensamento marxista. Esse evento ele faz parte do Seminário Internacional Marx, a Destruição Criadora, que conta com diversas etapas. Tivemos já, inclusive aqui em Porto Alegre, a presença de Slavoj Zizek, não é? A presença também de Michael Heinrich em outras capitais, aquele que é responsável do projeto Mega 2, Marx, Engels, Gesamtausgabe, que é a instituição curadora dos manuscritos de Marx e Engels e vem ensejando várias novas traduções das obras dos fundadores do materialismo histórico. E agora, com a presença que muito nos honra do professor David Harvey, com a Conferência Internacional para Ler o Capital, no contexto... para ler, para entender o Capital no contexto de lançamento no Brasil de sua obra Para Entender o Capital. O professor David Harvey é geógrafo britânico, professor de antropologia na pós-graduação da Universidade da Cidade de Nova York, The City University of New York, CUNY, e ex-professor de geografia nas universidades Johns Hopkins e Oxford. Seu curso sobre o Capital de Marx já teve mais de 300 mil acessos na internet, desde que foi disponibilizado no site da CUNY. Talvez esses 300 já estarão um número muito superior, certamente, professor. E autor de diversos livros, pela Boitempo Editorial, David Harvey lançou em 2011 O Enigma do Capital, está lançando agora Para Entender o Capital, livro 1, obra onde discute o Capital de Marx, e em breve se estará publicando Os Limites do Capital, uma outra obra importante na trajetória do professor David Harvey. Nós estamos, então, no marco desse seminário, lançando o livro do professor Harvey, e queria mencionar que tem uma banca representante da Boitempo aqui na frente, para aqueles que quiserem adquirir tanto o livro do Harvey como a nova tradução brasileira de O Capital, feita por Rubens Enderle, nova edição da Boitempo. Ambas as obras estão à venda e o professor David Harvey, ao final, vai autografar, lembrando aqui, pela quantidade de público, obviamente não será possível dedicatória, mas ele vai assinar, autografar o livro para aqueles que se colocarem. Estamos lançando também, à margem esquerda, o número 20, e registrar aqui já, sem me delongar mais, um pensamento de Marx que tem todas as contracapas das edições da nossa margem esquerda, que diz o seguinte: é certo que a arma da crítica não pode substituir a crítica das armas, que o poder material tem de ser derrubado pelo poder material, mas a teoria converte-se em força material quando penetra nas massas. Esse é o papel que a Boitempo, como uma editora comprometida com o pensamento crítico, se propõe a cumprir e vem fazendo com a publicação do seu 16º título no Brasil, com a nova tradução brasileira de Capital, e a obra de David Harvey, Para Entender o Capital, certamente vai trazer uma importantíssima contribuição nesse sentido. Por final, eu gostaria de pedir a todos e todas presentes que desligassem os celulares, quem ainda não o fez, Como mencionou a Luciana Genro, nós vamos, como a Luciana mencionou, nós vamos ter depois blocos de perguntas. Então, o pessoal aqui da organização vai estar recolhendo perguntas por escritos, que vão ser agrupadas em 2 blocos, e após a conferência do professor David Harvey, nós vamos ter, então, o debate. Então, passo a palavra ao professor. Muito obrigado pela sua presença e por ajudar a iluminar a crítica desse mundo capitalista e sua produção de desumanidades por urgentes alternativas societárias no planeta.
Well, thank you for coming. This is rather a special time. I come bearing both good news and hopeful news. And since it is rather rare for good news and hopeful news to come together, I think you will like to celebrate with me the following conjunctural events. The first is the new translation of Marx's Capital, Volume 1, which I'm told by many people is far superior to the one that existed before, and therefore makes available to you in its all its beautiful glory and all of its complexity and length, the Volume 1 of Capital. So that's the good news. The hopeful news is that you might actually get to read it. And you can get to read it, I hope, by either some help from me on the website, where the lectures of how to read it are available, or you can get the written version, which has also just come out, to Para Entender o Capital. Now, some other good news for you. I didn't start reading Marx until I was 35 years old. So for anybody who's under 35, you've got plenty of time to go far beyond my understanding of this text. You've got a good 15, maybe 20 years. And I think that the other good news that I can relate from my experience with it is that once you have read it, your understanding of the world and your perspective on the world will have changed very, very radically. You will see the world in a completely different way. There's a bit of bad news attached to that, which is that if you really want to change your vision in the way that Marx was suggesting, you've got to read all 3 volumes. It's not sufficient just to read Volume 1. But here's some hopeful news. My companion to Volume 2 is just going to press in English, and Boy Tompo will be publishing that in translation in due course. The other thing I would say, which is good news, is that once you've read it and changed your vision of the world, you'll find other people absolutely stunned at how intelligent you are, provided you don't tell them that you got the ideas from Marx. If you tell them this is Marx chapter 1, they all kind of run for the door. Or they think there's a spectre in the room, a ghost that has come to haunt them. But if you just use the concepts and the understandings and lay them out there, people say, my God, how elegant, how interesting, how smart. I experienced this a lot when I first read Marx, because I was living in a university and in a climate of the times where only terrorists and horrible people read Marx. So I had to put my copy of Marx in a brown paper packet. And when somebody asked me what I was doing, I said, well, I'm reading War and Peace, because it's a very thick book. But when I kept on coming back, and people said, it's taking you a long time to read War and Peace. And then I kind of, one day, I felt like saying to them, well, I'm learning Russian at the same time. So I didn't want people to know exactly what I was doing. And in this, I was very fortunate that I began teaching Marx in the geography program, in the engineering school, at a very conservative university. And the course's title was Capital. And it took 5 years for the dean and the administration to figure out that I was teaching Marx's Capital. They thought because I was a geographer, I was teaching a course about capital cities. By the time they got to me and started to complain of what I was doing, the course was well established. The chair of my department said I was doing it as an extra course above my formal load anyway. The students seemed to like it a lot. As far as he could tell, there was no real revolutionary action coming out of it. And he said, you know, he seems to keep them quiet by making them read a very thick book. And at that time, many radicals thought it was rather unradical to read. So I would get people in the class who would think it was about a certain kind of radicalism, and I'd say, we're going to read this book. And they'd look at it and say, all of it? And I'd say, yes. Man, that's not very radical. I said, you wait till you get to the end. No, a lot of them left. It was not radical enough. But at the time that I came in contact with it, I was also heavily involved in trying to unpack what had happened in the cities of the United States during the 1960s. In the 1960s, there were many urban rebellions. Watts in Los Angeles, Detroit, New York. And after the assassination of Martin Luther King, about 120 cities in the United States had significant unrest. In some cases, central cities were burned down. It was a massive uprising of the population. And there were two responses. One is repress them, and the other was we should figure out what the problem is and do something about it. So I became involved in an inquiry into what to do about it, and in particular, since the city I was in at that time, Baltimore, had had a very significant uprising. They had to bring in tanks and the National Guard to quell it. I became involved in looking into the housing question in Baltimore. And a lot of federal money came our way to support investigations and inquiries. We sat down with bankers, with landlords, with tenant organizations, community organizations, political leaders, federal agencies, to try to figure out what had gone wrong in housing provision. Because the housing conditions in the city were absolutely appalling, particularly for minority populations, predominantly African American, of course. And we wrote reports. And the first report we wrote, I started out the report by saying, well, there are two ways you can think about housing. You can think about it as a use value, as something that's useful to people. It provides shelter, it provides a space of intimacy, it provides a place where families can form, social relationships be developed, and you can go on where people can keep fish or something, you know, I mean, you can just list a large arena of use values which attach to the house. At the same time, the house has an exchange value. And the exchange value depends upon what it costs to make a house. It rests on what it costs to maintain a house. And the problem is that if you don't have enough exchange value, you can't get the use value that you need. So let's look, I said, about this balance between use and exchange value, and how there is a discrepancy between what the exchange value system is doing and what we really need it to do in the way of delivering use values to the mass of the population. Let's look at it that way. And I'm sitting there, and there are the bankers, there are the landlords, there are the city officials and everybody, and they say, God, that's such an intelligent way to look at it. I didn't tell them it's page 1 of Marx's Capital. But it is. So we went into great depth into the exchange value side of things. And we saw fairly early on that the exchange value side has certain characteristics, and that there's a history to this exchange value side. That throughout the history of capitalism, the exchange value has become more and more prominent in the way in which use values are delivered. And what is more, we are ideologically persuaded that this is the best way to provide use values. That if you're lacking use values, you've got to mobilize the exchange value system to do it. When the settlers came to the United States, the housing they built was largely built with their own hands, with their raw materials which were local. There was almost no exchange value. Yeah, saws, axes, nails were purchased in the market. But for the most part, the house was made as a use value by people. You get to the 16th, 17th, and then 18th centuries, and you suddenly find more and more housing gets built as a commodity, as an exchange value. So if you look, and you're in London or somewhere, and you see elegant Georgian terraces, they were built speculatively as commodities. Some of the developers went bankrupt. And of course, housing for the working classes in the 19th century was also built speculatively, bought up by landlords who then rented to the workers. So the exchange value started to become more and more significant. But over the last 100 years, it's become even more significant because it is recognized that a house has an exchange value which lasts and which can actually grow over time rather than diminish over time. So the exchange value starts to become an object of interest. And in particular, with all of the social unrest that occurred at the end of the 19th century, people started to think it was a good idea to pacify the population by allowing workers to become homeowners. in which case they could begin with a house, and if they could borrow money, they could buy the house, and by the end of their lives, they would have an asset which would be worth something, which they could pass on to their children, or which they could live in free when they retired. Home ownership for the working class was strategically seen by the bourgeoisie as a pacification measure. That is, you pacify the population. You get them on the side of private property because they are private property owners. You get them on the side of capital because they are accumulating wealth in the form of the house. You get them on the side of financial institutions that have lent them the money. And I had this good colleague for many years, Neil Smith, who used to have this big poster about home ownership being the big bulwark against Bolshevism. And so you created many institutions to facilitate home ownership. So the exchange value then becomes more and more significant, and it becomes significant socially. That is, affluent groups in the working class become very concerned to protect the exchange value of their house. So if somebody of low income moves into the neighborhood, or somebody proposes to set up a gas station or something in the neighborhood, homeowners say, no, you can't do it, it will diminish the value of my house. So you suddenly find within the working class exclusionary politics on the part of that part of the working class that became homeowners. We don't want blacks in our community. This is what I faced in Baltimore in the 1960s, because they bring the value of housing down. So we got to exclude them. We segregate the city. And the homeowners start to segregate even amongst themselves. That's a middle-class neighborhood. We don't want any of them here. We only want the real rich here. So this becomes, if you like, a dynamic, a social dynamic, as well as an economic dynamic. And about 30 years ago, housing became even more tied up with exchange value, because people were finding the housing market was an easy place to make money, to speculate. Even I could speculate, or somebody with very low income could speculate. You could buy a house for $250,000 with almost no down payment and no credit. And 3 years later, you could sell it for $350,000. You made $100,000 in 2 years. So everybody starts rushing into the housing market. Housing prices go crazy. The exchange value system is burning up in a fury. And then, of course, it explodes. And it crashes. And then what happens is that somewhere between 4 and 6 million people lose the use value of their housing. They essentially become homeless. Some of them ended up on the streets, some of them ended up with relatives, some of them ended up living in motels, some of them ended up living under the highways, some lived in tent cities. This is the story of how the crisis last time has an element in it in which the simple categories of use value and exchange value, which you get on page 1 of Capital, tells you an enormous amount of what happened and why it happened. And when you sit down with people and people say, what the hell happened? And if you've read page 1 of Capital, you can give them a good account. And if you use these categories in this kind of way and you don't say it's from page 1 of Capital, I can tell you, people think you're incredibly smart. There's another feature about a little way into chapter 1 of Capital. You find that exchange value can't exist without a measure. So exchange value requires that there be something called money. Now, what is money? It's a very interesting question. I'm running a course on money right now, and I asked the students at the beginning, what is money? And these are PhD students, and they had no coherent answer at all. Do you have a coherent answer? Do you know what money is? How to explain it and what it's about? Actually, I guess some of you will say this or that or that or this. But most people use money every day, chase money most of their lives, are actually besotted with the idea of how much money they got or not got, perpetually desire money, yet they have no idea what it is. Now, what kind of silliness is that? Now, Marx introduces a category in chapter 1 of Capital, which is called fetishism. Now, fetishism is about the way in which the things we use disguise something else. And he mainly talks about the fetishism of the commodity. But as you go on in Capital, you realize that the primary form of fetishism within capitalism is money, and the money form. It is the height of fetishism. So what is fetishism? Marx explains it in a very simple way. You go into the supermarket and you see a commodity. You take money and you buy the commodity. A simple transaction. Within that transaction, however, a lot is hidden. For instance, you know nothing about who produced that commodity. You know nothing about where it came from. You know nothing about the social relations involved in its production. You know nothing about the ecological conditions of its production. In other words, the commodity masks its origin. And that transaction, which you have, masks entirely all of those relations. And one of the things Marx suggests is that we should spend some time de-fetishizing things, getting behind them, finding what goes on behind them. He once famously said, if everything was as it appeared to be on the surface, there would be no need for science. Marx, throughout Volume 1 of Capital, is always using the word appears. It appears to be like this, but it really is something different. The commodity appears just as a thing. It's a lettuce, or it's potatoes, or it's cans of beans, or whatever. It just appears that way, and we just appropriate that thing with this other thing which we don't understand called money, and then we take it home and eat it or whatever. But what lies behind it? What I loved to do when I taught the beginning geography class in the university was to try to de-fetishize the commodity by asking people what they knew about where their breakfasts came from. Where did the sugar come from, for example? And people would say, well, I just bought it in the supermarket. And I say, no, let's find out how did it get into the supermarket? Who brought it into the supermarket? Where was it actually produced? And after a while, I'd take them back into the Dominican Republic, and the sugarcane cutters, and the sugar producers, and the sugar mills, and the wholesalers and the retailers and everything, and you would then attach a price, and you would suddenly see that what you are consuming is actually being produced under certain ecological conditions which are not very nice, under labor conditions which are absolutely appalling, at wage rates which are disgusting, and that's all on your breakfast table. Shouldn't you look at it and just throw up rather than eat it? People got very upset, actually, being forced to defetishize the commodity this way. And the joke usually was, after about a week or so of this, at least some of the students would say, "I didn't have breakfast this morning." So my response there was, "Okay, let's talk about last night's dinner." And of course, they all recognized that without this system, they would starve. We would all starve if it were not for this system. Yet, we know nothing very much about it. Once you know that, and students get very irritated at me. I had one come back about 10 years later after my geography class and said, "I still can't go into a supermarket without thinking about where it all came from." And I think that's healthy. If we all thought about where it came from and thought about our political and our moral and our human responsibilities to the ecological conditions and the human labor conditions out there, we would be living in a very, very different world. So defetishizing things is very important, and particularly defetishizing money. Marx actually sets up a very interesting way of looking at money. He says money is a measure of the sociality of labor. That is what it's measuring, and it's a claim upon that sociality of labor. But the sociality of labor is a social relation. And social relations are invisible and immaterial. And they always need a material representation. So money is a representation of the sociality of labor. It is a material representation of the sociality of labor. And the first form that money takes is a money commodity, like gold. And then the material qualities of gold are taken as the measure of the sociality of human labor. Now, you don't have to get into very sophisticated arguments about the theory of representation to know that representations both represent and falsify. As a geographer, I only know this too well. Maps represent, but they also falsify. Certain things you get straight, certain things you get are misleading. And you have to know what is the truthful part of the map and where the map is lying. And if you don't know where the map is lying, you get into all kinds of problems. And this comes about with the theory of map projections, for those of you who are into the geography side. It's impossible to take a globe and make a flat representation as a map without getting some things seriously wrong. You can get the directions right, in which case the areas look completely wrong. You can get the shapes right, in which case the directions and the areas are wrong. So what map projections does is to give you a very simple example of how a form of representation, which is absolutely critical for our understanding of the world, both represents and lies. And the same is true of money. It represents and it lies. Unfortunately, it represents in such a way that whereas the sociality of human labor is a social relation which is common for us all, money is appropriable by private persons. I can steal the gold. I can earn the gold. I can store the gold. And gold is a form of social power precisely because it is a claim upon human social labor. But because it can be appropriated by private persons, it is also the primary way in which wealth is amassed by individuals. And it therefore is the foundational form for the formation of a capitalist class. That is, it accumulates money as a form of social power. And as a form of social power, it can use it for all kinds of purposes, as Marx outlines very humorously in the economic and philosophic manuscripts. He says, if I'm ugly, but I have enough money, I can surround myself with beautiful women. If I'm stupid, I can surround myself with intelligent people. This is what money allows people to do. So money then is a form of representation. But the form of representation itself escapes from that which it's supposed to represent. There is, as Marx calls it, a contradiction between the money form and the sociality of human labor. Money guides us. Money animates us. The sociality of human labor does not. So we behave in such a way that we're pursuing this holy grail of money and the form of social power which it represents without understanding that which it represents, or necessarily doing anything to protect that which it represents. Which explains, by the way, one of the ways in which housing got into such crises. Because the money form becomes a fetish in its own right. And as the money form becomes a fetish, and you start to create new forms of money on the basis of the money commodity, you create credit monies, the credit monies become crazy. And of course, that is what happened, not only in the use-exchange value dilemma of the housing market, but what happened was that the exchange value measured by money was measured increasingly by this fetishized form of money, which ended up in these collateralized debt obligations and all these other crazy things, which everybody started buying and selling, even though they had no relationship whatsoever to social labor. They had no relationship to any value whatsoever. That is, the form of representation escaped the control of that which it was supposed to represent. And the result would be, it would be a bit like you're on an airplane, and so somebody gives the captain a map which is good on areas and completely wrong on directions. And where does the plane go? Well, it goes and it crashes somewhere. So this is what you learn from Marx's Capital. You learn how to deconstruct, if you like, defetishize much of what's going on around. And you learn to start to think about basic categories like money, like commodities, like what are the contradictions of this system. Now, actually, you can reformulate this around the idea of contradictions. I didn't do this in this book, but I'm now working on another book which is about reformulating it all in terms of contradictions. What's the contradiction between use and exchange value? Well, you can pretty soon see it when I describe what happened in the labor market, in the housing market. But out of that, there comes a political point. What kind of society should we be building? Should we be building a society which is about maximizing exchange values, usually for some small group in the population, and maybe delivering use values, though it turns out that the use values they deliver are usually to their own class? They don't like building affordable housing. Or should we be living in a society which said, actually, our primary concern should be that everybody in the society should have access to reasonable use values of housing? And the exchange value system should not be the major driver. The major driver should be use values. And what we see is the more exchange value becomes the major driver, the less well the system performs in actually delivering use values to particularly marginalized populations. Okay, I say simply, part of the political mission these days should be maximize the delivery of use values, minimize the damage that the exchange value system does. And if possible, let's work towards a society in which we eliminate exchange value entirely. But we have lived through 30 or 40 years where we've been told everything should be put under the exchange value calculus because that is a better way to produce it. In the United States, higher education has been put under the exchange value sign. And as a result, student debt in the United States now stands at, I don't know whether it's $1 or $2 trillion. So you have a mass of indebted students. And in exactly the same way people said about indebted homeowners don't go on strike back in the 1930s, now you've got indebted students who are, in a sense, living under conditions of debt peonage inside of the capitalist system. So the use value, exchange value contradiction is a very powerful way to start to reformulate what our politics should be about. Of course, we won't be able to eliminate exchange value overnight, but we can certainly reverse the last 30 years of hegemony of everything has to be done through the exchange value system. Healthcare, of course, is another big scandal in the United States. It has to be delivered through the exchange value system because that is the most efficient way, when every single measure we have shows that Medicare and Medicaid, which are the state-run parts of it, are super efficient compared to the delivery of it through the private insurance companies. The same thing applies when we start to look at the monetary calculus. Is there a way to drive money back to a situation in which it is not easy to fetishize it in the same way that it now is? Well, there was a German, well, he's Austrian-German thinker who lived in Argentina called Gesell, who wrote a very interesting, it's rather a right-wing tract in some ways, but he's very interesting about money. He said, you know, money perverts democracy. Money perverts the possibility of individual liberty and freedom. Therefore, we should have a form of money which doesn't permit accumulation. We should therefore have what he called oxidizable money, money that disappeared. You could only have it for a little while and then it It would be a bit like having the currency in tomatoes, that you'd only be able to exchange them for a week, and then after that they'd rot. So you'd have a currency form that would rot. Now actually you can make currency forms of this kind, and they were made back in the 1930s. It was very interesting. They had stamped money. And Keynes, in the general theory, talks about this as something that we should really take seriously. Stamped money was a piece of money that only lasted for a month. And if you wanted to renew it, you had to pay to get it renewed. So it would be a bit like having a $100 bill that was worth $100 for a whole month. And if you wanted to have it last the next month, you had to pay $5 in order to perpetuate its value. What a crazy world it would be if money did that. What would all the wealthy people do? What would all the billionaires do if they had to trot around the bank with their little notes and get them all stamped and pay $5 for each 100? Keynes thought this a very interesting idea. And I think that this is way also that one can start to think about alternatives by imagining alternatives. From no matter what political quarter, those alternatives are suggested. So these are some of the things that come out just from reading the first few chapters of Capital. What is money? Why is it that money is so fetishized? What can we do about that fetishization? Is there some way to curb the damage that is being done by this huge amount of indebtedness and the like? Now, all of this presupposes, of course, that Marx has covered everything that we really need to know. I try to make very clear to students when they're reading Capital that Marx does not actually write out a theory about capitalism as a social formation. What he does is to construct a theory of capital, which is a theory of how the economic engine which drives capitalism works. And so capital, therefore, does not take up many of the issues which people would be saying are terribly important within capitalism. And my answer to that criticism is he never tried to write a general theory of capitalism. And you have to appreciate him, therefore, for what he does, not go on and on and on about what he does not do. For instance, because he's concerned with the theory of capital and not with capitalism, there's very little about the history of racism or gender discrimination or nationalism, geopolitics, loyalties to place, effective loyalties to ethnic identities, religious beliefs. There's very little of that in Capital. Because he wanted to look at the economic engine. And the economic engine is how capital is produced, how it circulates, and how it reproduces itself. And so you have to ask yourself the question all the time when reading Marx's Capital: what is it that he is teaching me, and what is it that he is not even trying to teach me? He's not teaching us very much about the processes of social reproduction. He's not teaching us much about what's going on in the household. He's not teaching us about colonialism. He's not teaching us about racialization. He's just simply talking about the conditions under which the economic engine works and how it is self-contradictory and liable to crashes and crisis formation. So if we want to know where crises came from, you have to look at the economic engine, which doesn't say that all struggles which go on under capitalism are simply about the economic engine. There's a struggle over racism, there's a struggle about gay rights, there's a struggle about all of these elements in society. Marx does not tell us what to do about those struggles, but doesn't try to. So I often get criticized by many of my colleagues who are very much into questions of race and gender and all those sorts of things. And they say to me, you know, why don't you stop talking just about capital and why don't you talk about race and gender and all of that? And I say, well, one of the reasons I'm not talking about race and gender either is because you're not talking about the economic engine. And I want to keep that conversation about the economic engine very much alive. And there aren't many of us doing it these days. If I look at the number of academics in the United States who are dealing with racial questions, it's far, far more than those who are dealing with how the economic engine of capital works. And gender, of course, has taken over. So I said, there's plenty of you working on that. And I respect very much what you do. But just don't dismiss what I'm doing because it doesn't encompass what you're doing, because this would then tempt me to say I'm going to dismiss what you're doing because you don't take any notice of what I'm doing. So the economic engine then is, Marx isolates it. It's a form of abstraction. He builds this rather abstract model of this economic engine. Furthermore, even this economic engine is circumscribed in the way it is approached. It took me a while to figure this out. But after a while, I figured that Marx was actually making some very, very draconian and restrictive assumptions in writing Capital. And you have to know what these are if you can answer the question, what is it that Marx can teach me, and what is it that I need to know either from other sources or that I need to find out for myself? And the answer, I think, lies in a passage in the Grundrisse, where he's talking about classical political economy. Now, Marx's primary source of information was classical political economy. Basically, his method was, I read everything the classical political economists have said, all 200 of them or however many of them he read. I read them very carefully, and I make the assumption that all of them, from the 16th century onwards, were making a genuine attempt to understand the nature of the world that was emerging around them. And that therefore they were providing me with elements of the truth of that world, even when they were absolutely out to lie about it, be apologetic about it. But by a critical engagement with what they've written, I can actually come to a determination of what this world is really made up of and how it works. Now, later on, of course, he did study in detail what was going on in Russia, what was going on in the United States. He even undertook some anthropological inquiries. But his basic argument is out of a review and reconstruction of the arguments of the political economists. And he describes the general framework that emerges from that study of the political economists in the following way. He says, when you review what they've said, it turns out that production appears as the point of departure. Notice that word appears. Appears as the point of departure. Consumption as the conclusion. Distribution and exchange as the middle. Thus, production, distribution, exchange, and consumption form a regular syllogism, certain logical structure. Then he goes on to say, production is the generality, distribution and exchange the particularity, and consumption the singularity in which the whole is joined together. Production is determined by the general natural laws. By natural laws, he means natural to capitalism. So production is determined by the general natural laws, distribution by social accident, exchange stands between the two as formal social movement, and the concluding act, consumption, which is conceived not only as a terminal point but also as an end in itself, actually belongs outside economics, except insofar as it reacts in turn upon the point of departure and initiates the whole process anew. So production, then, is the generality. It is law-like. Distribution, by which he meant the actual wages, the profits, the interest rates, the rents, the profit on merchants' capital, all of those kinds of things, the taxes and so on. These, he says, are determined by social accident. They are particularities. Throughout Capital, Marx does not get into particularities very much at all. He sticks with the level of generality. Exchange is a social movement, a particularity also. Marx does not deal with the details of exchange. He doesn't want to deal, for example, with the question of competition. He says at some point, I'm going to write a separate book about competition. He never did. But throughout Capital, competition is treated as the enforcer of the laws of motion of capital, not as the determinant of those laws. So every now and again he appeals to competition to enforce the laws. It's the laws of competition that force technological change. It's the laws of competition that force the length of the working day to go to where it goes to. All those things. So competition is very weakly represented. In terms of the distributional requirements, the wage rate is scarcely discussed. The value of labor powers takes 2 pages in Volume 1 of Capital, and he lists a whole bunch of things and says, well, those are all to be taken into account, but for all intents and purposes, we assume the wage rate is fixed. And then that's it. There's no theory of wage determination in Marx. Consumption is a singularity. It is therefore chaotic, accidental, unpredictable, the product of human wants, needs, desires. Marx doesn't deal with that at all. He occasionally talks about the necessity for consumption, and he assumes consumption is occurring somewhere and somebody's consuming all the stuff, but he never studies consumerism. There is no theory of consumerism in Marx. And as a result of this, you get a rather strange theory of capital, which is the theory of the production of surplus value, the production of profit, the production and reproduction of profitability, the production and reproduction of the class relation. All of this goes on. But all the rest does not. Until you get into the 3rd volume of Capital, where Marx starts talking about problems of distribution. So if you want to understand what Walmart is doing or IKEA is doing, if you want to understand what the banks are doing, you've got to go read volume 3. So this framework is the framework of classical political economy. He then, in the Grundrisse, critiques it and said, well, this is no way really to understand how an economy works. You have to look at this as a dialectical motion within a totality. And he uses this language, everything relating to everything else. But the actual work of capital is framed in this classical political economic form. Again, this restricts what you can get from capital. But at the same time, it renders very profound that which you can get. So I'm very anxious to impart to you the following idea. That first, Marx is writing a theory of capital, not a theory of capitalism. If you want to know his opinions on capitalism, you can find it in some of the other texts, but not in Capital, or Theories of Surplus Value, or the Grundrisse. That literature does not do it. You can find it in 18th Brumaire, you can find it in Civil War in France, you can find it in his political writings and all the rest of it. You can find his writings on colonialism and so on. He writes about all of this stuff. And what's so interesting about those writings is they seem to be voluntaristic. Whereas capital is very deterministic. In order to survive, capital must be like this. It must do this. It absolutely has to do this. So you have a deterministic Marx of capital, and you have a voluntaristic, accidental Marx in all of the other writings. And some people have said, well, he was schizophrenic. No, he was not. He just simply wanted to say, I'm going to study this engine in this particular way, and this is going to teach us some very foundational things. For example, why all that money poured into housing markets from about year 2001 onwards. Why did that happen? And that you can get from Marx's understanding of political economy. You can't understand that by starting with a theory of racialization. You can't understand that by starting with a theory of gender or sexuality. Or what you can say is that when the crisis broke, it had racialized and gendered impacts, so that something like 70% of the asset values of the Hispanic population and the African American population were lost in the crisis, and only about 28% of the asset values of the white population were lost. So the impacts are racialized and gendered, but the origins cannot be explained. They have to be explained by going through Volume 1 and Volume 2 and Volume 3 of Capital. And you get very, very good explanation of why it all happened by working through all of those different contradictions that I indicated to you. The use value, exchange value contradiction. The contradiction between social labor and its representation as the monetary form, which also rests on the contradiction between private property and the state. And you can go on and on and on in this vein and get a very good picture of where that crisis came from, but also you get a very good picture of what would have to happen if you want to be anti-capitalist. And this is, I think, one of the critical points that comes out of Marx. Marx describes what the economic engine which powers capitalism is about. He describes it so well that you know that is the economic engine that you have to displace if you want to end capitalism. That doesn't mean you've dealt with all of the other problems at all. But if you are anti-capitalist, which for a variety of reasons I am, then what this analysis does is to give you a good idea of what it would mean. You emphasize use values, not exchange values. You emphasize social labor, you try to defetishize the monetary form. You displace the state-private property by a common property regime under collective management. In other words, you end up with a political project, a political vision of what it means to be anti-capitalist by having a much better understanding of what capital is and what capital does. This is what you can get from a careful study of what Marx said. And this is something which I think is very, very profoundly important for our contemporary moment, given the trouble that capital is in, and the even deeper trouble that capitalism is in. So that is why I think I'm very happy to be able to give you both the good news that you have the new volume of this, and the hopeful news that, my God, you're going to read it. Thanks very much.
Bom, depois dessa brilhante conferência, professor David Harvey, nós vamos então abrir para o momento de perguntas. As perguntas deverão ser formuladas por escrito o mais objetivamente possível. A Gabriele Tolotti, da Fundação Lauro Campos, está aqui recolhendo, passando. Nós vamos agrupá-las. O professor responde o primeiro bloco, depois temos lugar a um segundo bloco. Como o senhor entenderia quais as causas e também as formas mais determinantes na eclosão da recente crise financeira e crise econômica mundial, né? Seja a questão da lei da queda tendencial da taxa de lucro ou a discussão sobre sobreacumulação, entre outras formas, causas ou formas de manifestação da crise, pensando nos diferentes termos no âmbito do debate marxista. Uma segunda questão: como o senhor avalia a condição, né, ou como caracterizar o trabalho, o processo de trabalho daqueles indivíduos que executam teletrabalho, ou trabalho através da internet, novas formas de, enfim, em rede, e ao mesmo tempo também o trabalho do professor, né? Existe mais-valia? Como é que se dá o processo de exploração? Como se encontra a questão valor de uso, valor de troca, essa contradição no trabalho dessas categorias. E, por fim, uma terceira questão: como o senhor vê hoje o debate a respeito do pós-modernismo, da pós-modernidade e a recente fase do capitalismo?
Forms and reasons for the present crisis.
The recent crisis, overaccumulation,
Okay.
the trend for the profit rate to fall.
Yeah. I think there are always complications, and it's very hard to give an answer to where does the crisis come from in less than another 2 hours. But I'll give a very basic version of how I look at it. If you look at the capital circulation process, capital starts the day with a certain amount of money, typically goes into the marketplace, finds means of production and labor power, buys those means of production and labor power, selects a technology, puts the labor power and the means of production together, and produces a new commodity, which at the end of the day is sold for the original money plus the surplus value or the profit. The result is that there is more at the end of the day than there is at the beginning of the day. Now, the situation then arises as to what do capitalists do the following day with the more that they got yesterday. For a variety of reasons, and competition comes into this, they're forced to reinvest some of the extra they got yesterday in expanding their production. So they go and get more means of production, more labor power, and keep going in that way. The result of this historically has been that capitalism has always been about perpetual growth. And you will notice that the press will start to get very upset if the growth rate falls much below 3%. They're very happy if it's 4%. If it's 6%, people start to worry about overheating or something. But the standard thing that you'll find is that people seem to be pretty content with a 3% growth. Now, 3% growth is a compound rate of growth. And it's very strange that people don't understand compound interest. Because compound interest takes you along like this, and then it does this, and it does that. It puts you on a logistical growth curve. The data that's been assembled now by economic historians suggests that capital has actually grown at a compound rate of 2.25% since around 1800. A lot of that 2.25% was like this, the slow bit. But then in compounding, you get an inflection point where you start to curve upwards, and then you go very fast. Very fast. Marx was amused by something that somebody had written at the end of the 18th century, who said that if I had taken a silver coin at the date of the birth of Jesus Christ, and I had invested it at a compound growth rate of 6%, by the time you got to the end of the 18th century, you would have silver coins that would fill the whole of the solar system, out as far as Saturn. And this is what compounding growth rate is about. Now, I think there's been some difficulties on that inflection point about finding real profitable investment opportunities for this compounding rate of growth. So one of the things that's happened since the 1970s, when I think we started to move through that inflection point, is that we see more and more money flowing into assets and acquiring assets. And we had the dot-com bubble, the new economy bubble, we had, there was, of course, the China thing opening up. I mean, tremendous new things going on. But it was very unstable. People think the crisis began in 2008, but what about Argentina in 2001? What about Brazil shortly before that? What about Russia that defaulted in 1998? What about Thailand? What about Indonesia that crashed in 1998? In other words, the last 30 or 40 years of supposedly neoliberal genius has seen a great deal of volatility, many crashes. And the crashes have always, it seems to me, been characterized by the fact that there's a surplus around that nobody knows what to deal with. And that comes out of that simple model of, well, at the end of the day, you need more. where does the more go? And what can we do with the more? Right now, the estimate in the United States is that businesses, which are not hurting, by the way, at all, they've had some of the highest rates of profit for a long time, businesses are sitting on something like $2 trillion of money, not knowing what to do with it. Well, I can tell you one of the things that's being done with the surplus these days is to engage in a worldwide, what we call land grab. Grabbing land, grabbing resources, grabbing assets, grabbing intellectual property rights. In other words, there's a bubble going on right now. I don't know what's happening to land prices here in Brazil. I know in Argentina they're skyrocketing. In the United States they're skyrocketing. There's an incredible pressure. Surplus capital with nowhere to go. It's buying up huge chunks of Africa. It's buying up resources, it's buying up, and it's not simply coming from, that's not just simply the United States. The big buyers up in Africa are China and India. China's very active in capturing Latin American resources now. And you're very, very dependent, I think, on the China trade. So, where did the crisis come from? It came from surplus capital with nowhere to go, suddenly finding the property market was a good place to go. And the interesting thing is that already by 2003, many people in that market knew it was going to crash. And it's not simply after the event them saying, oh, I knew it was, just to make it sound like they were smart. Actually, if you go back, you'll look and you'll see people were saying, it's going to crash. And the only interesting thing to them was, when was it going to crash? Because if they could stay in until the last moment before it crashed, they would make millions and millions. And this is what went on. And of course, they unloaded a lot of the debt by these investment vehicles, which they persuaded everybody. So where did the crisis come from? It came from, I think, the impossibility of sustaining compound growth at 3% forever. It came from the fact that surplus capital could not find profitable outlets except in asset bubbles. I mean, mini asset bubbles like the art market. The art market did well during this period. I mean, got surplus money, buy a Picasso. And actually, that market is very vigorous and going well. The crisis, as far as the capitalist class is concerned, is a great opportunity to gain assets for nothing. What do you think is happening to all those foreclosed houses in California? Hedge funds and private equity vehicles are going up and buying them up en masse, with the idea that in 3 or 4 years' time, if things recover, they'll make a killing. This is what they did in Southeast Asia in 1998. This is what they're doing again. The capitalist class has done extremely well out of this crisis. So when people say to me, oh, this is a terrible crisis, everybody's hurting, you say, no. And they say, is this the end of neoliberalism? No, this is neoliberalism doubled. If you take the view that I do, that neoliberalism was always a class political project to capture as much of the surplus as possible. And if you look at the distribution of income figures, they're absolutely astonishing right now. It's just that they're globally spread. You've got plenty of billionaires now in Brazil. You've got a lot of billionaires in India and in China. The global oligarchy, if you want to call it that, is in an incredible position of power dominance on the money front. So they are controlling it, but at the same time, they're finding difficulty of putting money someplace. And when they put it someplace, they need to put it someplace where either they can expand real production, minerals or something of that kind, as in central India and so on, where there's a Maoist rebellious movement against all of this, land grabbing. Or you put it in such a way that you can engage in what I call accumulation by dispossession. That is, you can engage in daylight robbery. The most recent example of an attempt at that was Cyprus. I mean, what was going on? The banks were in difficulty. The European Union said, you've got to get the money out of the depositors in the bank. So essentially, the population was going to lose about 7% of the value of its bank deposits. In order for what? To pay off the bankers and to pay off the bondholders in Europe. In other words, you always try to put yourself in a situation where you have a vulnerable population who you can rob, which is what happened in the US housing market. There were vulnerable populations, African Americans, Hispanics, single-headed households by women, all of whom suffered immensely. They bore the brunt of the crisis. And if you look at, for example, the losses that occurred in the African American population, they roughly corresponded to the bonuses that the Wall Street bankers were paying themselves. Now, I can't prove that it was that money that went into the Wall Street bankers' pocket, but if you see a situation where this group over here loses this billions of dollars, you know, about $40 billion, 40 or 50 billion dollars, and this group over here gets 40 or 50 billion dollars, I'm going to make an inference and say there's been a transfer of wealth here. And the transfer of wealth should have been in the other direction, not in this direction. But, of course, the system is set up increasingly under neoliberal rules. The system is set up precisely to allow not only robbery by exploitation of labor, but also accumulation by dispossession. People losing their health care rights, people losing their pension funds. Look at what's happening to the population of Greece, what's happening to them on a daily basis. My colleagues in Greece, some of them have been forced to retire. They've been told they cannot draw their pensions for 2, 3, some cases 4 years. So they have 3 or 4 years after they retire with no income. How are they going to live? I mean, this is the world that we've constructed. And this is the world that has to be completely transformed, but it can't be transformed by a little bit of political reform here and political reform there. That's why we've got to go back and get to the engine at the base of it all. Now, there are a lot of technical questions. I think the second question was about internet, right? You know, there's a weird idea that the internet functions in the ether somewhere. Actually, a lot of people are employed in the physical infrastructures that are required for the internet to work. And of course, building the platforms, which are communicative devices. One of the things you'll notice, however, is when the internet started, it was a pretty democratic setup. It's now increasingly the case that it is monopoly controlled. And that, you know, Google and Amazon and the rest of it are controlling an immense amount and are in a position to control. And what's more, they actually use that control position to extract information. So when you start getting targeted advertisements, you know that Google's on your case. And it's figured out what it is you're spending your money on in the credit cards, and they're figuring out what it is you're susceptible to, and they're turning the advertisers on specifically to these given markets. I mean, this is what's happening. It's even happening politically. The Obama campaign used this actually as a campaign tactic. So this is, of course, a lot of work going into both hardware and software production. And of course, the internet does not function without computers, and you have to take a very good look at Foxconn and places like that, and the labor processes in China where your computers get produced. Better go look at where your cell phones are produced. So there's a vast physical world, and of course electricity. There's a vast physical world of productive activity which surrounds the internet. So this idea that somehow or other this is immaterial labor and that there is a world of immaterial labor is utter nonsense. It's very material labor, and it has material consequences. And so it's no different than happened when the telephone came or something like that. It's no different. So this idea we're living in a different world because of the internet, I don't get it. Now, surely, as a means of communication, it can be used in all kinds of directions, all kinds of ways. It can be used, indeed, to mount a protest, but it's also used, of course, to guide drone strikes against people you don't like. And that's always been the way with communication systems. They can be used this way or that way. And the politics of it are indeed, and the regulatory politics of it are indeed very significant and very important. And the whole kind of question of intellectual property rights and how they may be established or not established on the web are part and parcel of it. So I think if we analyze that world, then we have to analyze it as a complete world. Not just fantasize that there's, that there's somebody dreaming something and it just floats through the internet magically and arrives. I mean, that's a fetishistic view of what the internet is about. So you've got to de-fetishize our understanding of the internet very, very intensely. There's an extended debate, this is the third question I think, about the relationship between productive and unproductive labor in Marx. I don't like the debate. I think it's boring. And when I hit a part of Marx that I find boring, I just generally say, well, it's boring and I'm not interested. And that upsets people because masses of people have written about our university lecturers unproductive workers or productive workers. I actually don't care. And I think the debate, I was trying to ask Michael Heinrich, who was here in Sao Paulo and who knows Marx's manuscripts in the originals and very well, what he thought of the whole debate. And he said, the problem is that the left imagined that the only workers who could change the system were, quote, productive workers. That unproductive workers were not in a position to change the system. Because the productive workers, by withdrawing their labor, could stop the system, whereas the unproductive workers couldn't do anything. So the theory of revolution rested on defining who was or was not a productive worker. It's a crazy idea. I mean, who produced the Paris Commune? Was it productive workers or unproductive workers? Well, if you look at the people engaged in the Paris Commune, all sorts of people in different economic positions, different job titles and so on, participated in the commune. And this is taken in left law as being one of the greatest uprisings in socialist history. And yet it was an uprising that was the result not of looking for an alternative socialist world, but an alternative urban world. And I always think it was symbolic that the first two measures the Commune passed was one, suspension of night work in the bakeries, which is a labour question, and the second was the moratorium on all rents, all housing rents, which is an urban question. And I think, for me, in the last book I wrote, Rebel Cities, I take the argument that I don't think we should be thinking about the vanguard as somehow or other being constituted by the factory worker. We should be thinking about all those people who produce and reproduce urban life as being potentially revolutionary subjects. And we've seen those revolutionary subjects in motion. Anti-gentrification protests. You mentioned the events in Rio. Who was involved in that? Productive workers? Or people who have a view of what their rights are in that particular urban environment? It's a struggle over the right to the city. It's a struggle over a right to define an alternative urban life. It's a struggle to be able to assert certain kind of identities in urban settings freely, as is the struggle of gay liberation and all the rest of it. I mean, these struggles are integral to what politics is about. And for me, therefore, the question all of us should be involved in is what alternative economic engine can be constructed, and for me, what kind of alternative economic engine is going to produce what kind of city? Because right now our cities are essentially produced by capital. They are the product of that system I'm telling you about, the rules of capital accumulation, and the city is and urbanization is one of the big absorbers of surplus capital. So it builds cities because it has to in the way it does. And our cities look that way, not because we want them to look that way, but because that's what capital needs to do in order to survive. So the question of, whether professors are productive or not, I actually like the idea I'm unproductive. As Marx kind of said, actually under capitalism, to be productive is actually to encounter a misfortune. And so I'm very happy that I'm not productive of surplus value. I'm very happy if I can get out of being productive on surplus value. And I still like to think that I might just have a little bit of a capacity to be a revolutionary subject. Thanks.
Obrigado, professor. Nós passamos... Alô?
Se ouve? Sim. Nosso bloco final, 4 questões foram selecionadas, em seguida a sessão de autógrafos. Uma primeira pergunta que foi feita, e um elemento que a gente precisa ressaltar também na trajetória do professor Harvey, a respeito da sua contribuição para a constituição daquilo que se chama um materialismo histórico geográfico. A questão do espaço na sua obra e, no seu ponto de vista, quais seriam as questões determinantes para se pensar espacialmente um materialismo histórico geográfico. Uma segunda questão, como na sua avaliação se organiza, e que deriva da primeira, se organiza espacialmente o mundo capitalista, né? A questão do imperialismo, do desenvolvimento desigual, como o senhor conceituaria a economia mundial pensando a existência de um capitalismo central, ou de periferias e semi-periferias, ou países dependentes, como fica a questão do imperialismo, que o senhor também já escreveu a respeito. Houve uma terceira pergunta sobre a questão ecológica, e se a questão ecológica pode ser considerada um tema determinante para uma perspectiva anticapitalista, e como entra, no seu ponto de vista, a ideia do ecossocialismo nesse sentido. Uma quarta questão, o senhor, na entrevista que deu para um jornal local, publicada hoje, né, coloca que a crise econômica mundial ela se manifesta de diferentes formas. Ela é sentida e sofrida de diferentes maneiras, com locais ou países com mais ou menos índices de desemprego, locais ou países com mais ou menos quebras financeiras, mas, de qualquer maneira, ela é uma crise global. E o senhor abordou há pouco a questão da China, né, e que os países latino-americanos têm cumprido um papel dentro dessa locomotiva mundial que é a China, se apropriando de recursos naturais dentro do que o senhor conceitua como acumulação por dispossessão. Em que medida a gente pode fazer uma relação entre o seu conceito de acumulação por dispossessão e um outro conceito importante na sua obra, ao discutir os arranjos de espaços temporais, Spatial Temporal Fixed, no sentido de acelerar o tempo de rotação do capital para contrarrestar os efeitos da crise. E se isso for correto, em que medida o território da América Latina nós estamos contribuindo para apagar os efeitos da crise no capitalismo central e em países emergentes como a China?
Wow. I think it is very important to disaggregate the crisis in terms of how it has unfolded geographically. Part of what I really have tried to do is to emphasize uneven geographical development, not as a simple impact of what capital is about, but as fundamental to the reproduction of a capitalist mode of production. So the uneven geographical development is a critical perspective for me, and it constitutes one half, if you like, of my concern for what I call a historical geographical materialism. The other half is constituted by doing something which Marx tends to exclude from capital, which is what he called a universal level, which is the metabolic relation to nature, which in my talk I did not mention, but he talks about the metabolic relation to nature and says this is a universal condition, and I'm therefore not concerned with it because it is not specific to capital. But this means that there's very little mention in capital of questions of environment, ecological degradation, and the like. There are a few passages here and there, and you can take some of his other writings and see that he was sensitive to these questions. But this is one of the big pieces of work which needs to be further done. I consider he was not a very good geographer, and this is, again, some of the work that I've tried to splice into Marx's theorizing, and I think it's important. It's been very difficult, by the way, to get many Marxists to take the geography seriously. I recounted the other day that many of the big-name Marxists tend to dismiss my work because, you know, I'm either dealing with a minor problem called urbanization, or I'm playing around with this specific thing called geography. And I even had one of the more famous big-name Marxists who 10 years ago or so said to me that he'd never read anything I had written because he could not imagine that a geographer would have anything significant to say. Marxists are not very nice, you know. But the point about this is I think it's very crucial for everybody to look. I mean, I think the urbanization question, the uneven geographical development questions are very important to integrate into the analysis. When I say we have to ask the question, what can Marx do for us and what do we have to do for ourselves? This is something I very much took on board as something I had to do for myself. And I'm still working on it. But it's very clear that we have to be careful about making grand generalizations. I mean, there's a grand generalization that Europe is in crisis and Europe is gone and blah, blah, blah. Actually, Scandinavian countries, Finland, Germany, Netherlands, and so on, are not doing badly at all. In fact, they're doing very well. They have very low unemployment rates. And obviously, their financial situation is secure compared to, you know, what's going on in Ireland or what's going on in Spain and Greece and Portugal and the like. So the geographical thing is very important, but you have to look at the production of that geographical thing. The formation of the euro. All along, it seemed to me that this was a way in which Germany could exert its superior productive capacity uncontested across the whole of that part of the European Union that would go into the euro. The result was that German industry profited immensely from the creation of the euro. It effectively destroyed industrial capacity throughout Southern Europe because Germans have superior productive capacity. It essentially dominated the markets in Southern Europe. You go to Southern Europe, and who runs the telecommunication systems? Well, Siemens and so on, and you know. And who runs Athens Airport? The Germans do. So you have a situation where the Germans extracted a great deal of wealth from Southern Europe through trade. And then, of course, eventually there's a difficulty within the whole system, and Southern Europe can't borrow anymore, and the Southern Europeans did some stupid things, absolutely no question. And then the Germans turn around and blame them for everything and say, well, it's none of our business, they say. You did it all, so you have to pay. Well, actually, if you went back and look at the trade figures and everything like that went on in the first 10 years of the euro, you would say the Germans should rebate just half of that, and actually the Southern European debt crisis would be over. But this comes about because of uneven geographical development. And it connects to this kind of notion of imperialism. I don't like the term imperialism too much anymore, even though I used it because everybody was using it. I far prefer what Giovanni Arrighi calls hegemony within economic systems. And there are sub-hegemonies, and clearly Germany has been hegemonic within the European space, in much the same way that Brazil is hegemonic within the Latin American space. And it used its hegemonic position to its own advantage. I'll refrain from making any comments on Brazil, because I want to get out of here alive. But you can see what I mean. China is obviously hegemonic in East Asia, but China is exercising hegemony beyond East Asia. Some of it you're feeling here. In Africa, China is very hegemonic. Indian capital is now moving in a hegemonic way into Africa. If you look at Zambia, Zambia is extremely rich in copper resources. The Zambian copper resources are pretty exclusively mined by the Indians and the Chinese, who have done what every imperial power always does, which is to cut a deal with the Zambian elite, but a deal with the Zambian elite which does not necessarily help the mass of the population. And as speculative activity picks up, the Zambian elite gives the copper companies rights of exploitation in areas which involve the displacement of populations, and here we go, displacement, economy of dispossession. But it's not the nasty Americans or the awful Europeans, it's the Chinese and the Indians who are doing it. And actually, any country that ends up producing surplus capital ends up doing the same thing. Some of the worst labor practices to be found in the world in the late 1990s were subcontracted factories run by the South Koreans and the Taiwanese. Because towards the end of the 1970s, South Korea started to find itself with surplus capital. In early 1980s, Taiwan started to find itself with surplus capital. What was it going to do with it? So it started to export capital, and it exported capital in the form of factories. They both exported a lot into China. So you can find sort of whole areas of Shanghai that are effectively dominated by Taiwanese capital. But a lot of Taiwanese capital went to Central America, South Africa, and there you found some of the most exploitative and horrible labor practices you could possibly find. Now you look at it and you say, well, am I going to call this imperialism or what am I going to call it? Well, it's about surplus capital looking for spatial fixes, as I call it, looking for new places to go where it can exert the maximum level of exploitation. Now, many of the Taiwanese subcontractors were subcontracting to American corporations. So the Taiwanese were producing the goods that were coming to the Gap or Nike or whatever, and so you get this chain of exploitation, which merchant capitalists like Walmart has become absolutely expert at exploiting. The result is the profit rate on production in China is very low because most of the profit which is really produced there is actually realized in the United States through Walmart sales. So there are these structures of domination, hegemony, which are worked out in these very complicated kind of ways. And I think that the simplistic notion of imperialism loses, if you like, what that is all about. And I think that, therefore, we have to unpack, again, de-fetishize these commodity chains and where they're coming from and where they're going to. You know, where did your computer come from? Where did your cell phone come from? What do you know about the labor conditions of the people who produce them? Why are you so delighted when the price of cell phones goes down, when you hear about all these suicides going on in the factories in China? Why are you so delighted to find these really cheap, rather nice clothes, and you find out that actually in Bangladesh 200 people died in a fire in a factory where Walmart and all the other labels were there, even though Walmart denied that they were there? What are we going to do about all of that? So there is a mission here which sometimes sounds incredibly complicated, But again, one of the things I like about Marx is he very often provides us with the very simple categories, like the one I use, which is a transformation of Marx's notion of primitive accumulation into accumulation by dispossession. And you ask, well, if accumulation by dispossession is going on all over the world, and it's going on in urban areas as people get displaced in New York City or in Rio to make way for mega projects, if it's going on the land in Africa, if it's going on in Iowa in agriculture, if it's going on in many peasant communities, right in China, if it's going on everywhere, why not say to, I don't know, some organizations, why don't we think about a united struggle against the accumulation by dispossession? And there are organizations that are in a position to do that. Via Campesina, for example, is a large organization. It could adopt that as a slogan. It could actually go and organize around this all over the place and have a mass global movement, because the economy of dispossession, given where we are in that inflection point, we are more likely in the future to be living in economies of dispossession than we are going to be living in economies of expanded production. I'm not saying expanded production is going to disappear. No, it's not. It's going to be there, very strong. But the amount of accumulation by dispossession under neoliberalization has been very, very large, and it's growing, and it ain't going to go away. So by taking simple concepts like that, and, you know, use value, exchange value, all the rest of it, and the economy of dispossession, just by taking that, it seems to me that we can simplify what looks like an incredibly complicated field of political action and find out what is the unity within the difference. We spend a lot of time talking about the differences that fragment unity, but instead of that, we should be talking about the unities that exist within the differences. Don't try to suppress the differences. That's not the point. Try to deal with the unities, and the unities are simply that capital is engaging in a politics and an economics of dispossession. And it has to these days, and I think that situation is going to get much worse. So with that thought, thank you again very much.